shining a light on the issue of domestic violence.
The United Nations study out this week finds domestic violence is one of the most common killers of women around the world.
Fears are growing at domestic violence shelters. Domestic violence experts in our top story.
Well, a domestic violence situation quickly turned into an assault.
The federal government calls it a pervasive problem that frequently goes undetected.
We're talking about the courage that it takes to come forward as a victim.
Hey, welcome back to Community Voices, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another special episode. I know I say that every week, but today's really great, and this is why. We are joined by Chris Huffine. He is the Executive Director of Allies in Change in Portland. And, let me just read his bio, because it's awesome. So Chris is a licensed psychologist, has worked with abusive men for the past 28 years. He is the Executive Director of Allies in Change. During his career, he has worked with thousands of abusive men and dozens of female and male victims of abuse. He is considered to be a national expert on working with abusive partners and has provided trainings around the country, including a semi-annual 40-hour training in Portland on the Allies in Change curriculum. He is a member of the advisory group to the Oregon State Attorney General to monitor standards for batterer intervention programs and of the Oregon Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team. So this is a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while, and it's for this reason. I asked him, why are you passionate about what you do? He said, it is important work focusing on truly stopping abusive behavior rather than simply helping people escape from it. So we talk about that. We talk about, that's what Saving Grace does. We help people be safe, right? And stable and be empowered with their own present and future. Find healing from all the past abuse. So we talk about all that, and it's really a great conversation. So glad you joined us. Enjoy. Chris, thanks so much for joining Community Voices.
You're welcome.
And clearly you have an extensive background that I was just able to read for everyone. And, Allies in Change, what does it say here? That you're one of the largest in the country, is that right?
Well, so we're not in terms of, so Allies in Change is a private nonprofit 501c3, and we're like a counseling center, but we have a large program that works with abusive partners. And the program is one of the larger ones in the state. I'm not even sure if it's the largest in the state, but one of the things that's noteworthy is that we offer a number of specialized groups for people who have been abusive. And in particular, we probably work with more voluntary abusive partners than any other program in the country. Most of the programs out there work primarily with court-involved people who have been arrested for domestic violence or where child welfare is involved and that sort of thing. And we work with those people as well. We also are in part reaching out to people who are not court-involved but are dealing with this issue. And we also offer a group for women. We also offer a LGBTQ multi-gender group as well.
Right. Yeah, I see that here. What in the world made you want to get in and spend the past 28 years in this kind of work?
Well, it was something like for many of us, it's something I fell into. I was looking for work back in 1992 and had an opportunity to start working at Men's Resource Center, running groups for abusive men. And it was checked a number of boxes for me. It was group work, which I enjoyed. It was working with adults. This was an issue that I think had a lot of relevance. There's a gendered aspect to it, which I'm very interested in. So it was a satisfying mix of doing education and teaching, but also providing therapy work, change work. So it was a very good fit. And I started back in 92 and have been doing it ever since.
And clearly I'm sure that you have heard over 28 years some really troubling stories, perspectives, justifications for violence. What has been the thing that has kept you in this work?
Well, it's really needed work, and it's important work. And it's also satisfying work because, certainly not everybody that we work with makes change, but if they make changes, the abusive behavior stops. And, that isn't the case when you're working with the people who are being abused. I mean, you can help them get safe. You can help them take better care of themselves. But ultimately, they're not in control of whether the abuse stops or not. Whereas when you're working with the abusive partner, you are. So that's very satisfying, I think. It continues to be a significant and serious issue. So it's important work. It's something that, as I've thought about doing other kinds of careers, other things like that, this one just feels like one that is fulfilling and important and needed. And so it keeps me going. I think seeing the real changes that some individuals make, seeing the success they can have in their families, that's certainly very gratifying when it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm curious because one thing, so as I think I mentioned before on here, I send out this questionnaire for our guests to complete. And the question, why are you passionate about what you do? This was your response. It is important work focusing on truly stopping abusive behavior rather than simply helping people escape from it, which I really like that, because I've always loved that quote. I used to work for a homeless agency, drug and alcohol recovery. And so, the quote about at some point you got to stop pulling people out of the river. You got to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So your answer made me think of that. So what, considering what we do, helping people get safe, get escape from it, as you said, how can an organization like Saving Grace and Allies in Change work best together?
Well, the reality is there's no reason to think that even if you help an abused partner or their children get safe, that the person who's been abusive is going to stop being abusive, unless they take a vow of, chastity and not going to be in another relationship. And so I think ultimately we have got to focus more on the people who are causing the harm, the people who are doing the abusive behavior. And we can't just do that with punishment and incarceration for a variety of reasons. So that's how really I'm committed to stopping domestic violence, and I've had energy for that for a very long time. The way I'm choosing to do that is by working with the people who are, actually I do work with survivors as well. I work with abused partners, but primarily I work with the people who are doing the abuse. And we've got to be addressing them. And that's been a challenge to work with them, as well as to see them in anything other than a punitive way, which is also not helpful. One of the things that I've been struck by, because I've talked with and listened to hundreds of abused partners over the years, is the vast majority of them don't want the abusive partner punished. They want the abuse to stop. They want them to stop their behavior. And even if they no longer want to be with that abusive partner, they still want that behavior to stop, whether it's for the benefit of their children, for the benefit of other people who could end up in relationship with them. And so it's rare, actually, I hear from the abused partner what they want is punishment. I want them to be punished. Much more typically, I just want them to stop. I want them to change. And that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's an important part of dealing with all this, is we've got to focus more on the abusive partners.
And what is there, a top 3, top 5 hurdles that you've seen in your career of what keeps the abusing partner from changing?
Well, it's a larger community issue. And so there are lots of ways that we collude with it. The whole idea of, the classic line is it takes a village to raise a child. And the rejoinder to that is, well, it takes a village to abuse a child as well. And so part of us really making change on domestic violence is not just helping individual families. It's really, as a community, taking a stance on that. And so there's several things, if you want like the top 3. One thing is to understand what domestic violence really involves, which is that the vast majority of it involves non-physical abuse. It involves verbal and psychological abuse, economic and financial abuse. It involves a lot of controlling behaviors. So a much wider range. And the reality is that most people who are being abused don't even consider themselves to be in an abusive relationship. In fact, they're not even going to, and because of that, they're not going to seek out services from an organization such as yours, Saving Grace, because they don't even think it's domestic violence. When they think of domestic violence, they think of somebody with a black eye and broken bones and in fear of their lives. And of course, there are some abused partners that can check those boxes, but the vast majority cannot. So that's one trick, is that most domestic violence isn't even being addressed. And so part of that is raising public awareness about what does constitute abusive behavior and domestic violence, and getting beyond kind of the criminal justice way of thinking about it. So that's one thing, is just public awareness. And we've seen this like in parallels in the substance abuse field. Back when I was first starting out, people had very narrow definitions of addiction. It's like an alcoholic and, Skid Row or what have you. Nowadays, we all have a much more nuanced understanding of substance abuse. I mean, 6-year-olds can describe addiction to you pretty accurately. So we understand this as culture now. We see that substance abuse is a serious issue, and we all have a role to play in addressing it, whether it's as employers, as healthcare providers, as neighbors, as friends, as family members. And that's where we need to get with domestic violence, that same kind of attitude and approach, that it's a whole community response, much larger community response. And then I think a third thing is we need to move away from the idea of punishment as the primary intervention, the idea of arrest and incarceration and punishment. That's just one small part of what we need to be doing. There's clear evidence that punishment alone changes very few behaviors. You can sometimes contain it to some extent, but you're not going to change it. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really understanding that if we're serious about stopping domestic violence, in part we need to work with the people who are doing this. And then it's also, I guess, one more would be changing larger social values around what it means to be strong and tough, what it means to be a man. We know that the significant majority of domestic violence is perpetrated by males, people who identify as males, although there are some women and other folks who do it. It's primarily men. And it has most of us in the field would agree that it has to do with masculinity and kind of definitions of masculinity. So it's really kind of changing core values and things of that nature as well, if we're really going to address this. So those are a few of the things, challenges and, if you will, hurdles that we're trying to overcome to help stop this.
Yeah, really well said. I feel like we could spend the rest 30 minutes just on those three easily. Yeah. Yeah. So let's transition here. I was also struck by what you said. Also, most of the time, DV is hidden in ways that mean people being abused do not realize that they're being abused, like you said. I've heard that a ton from someone saying, like, I'm not a survivor, like it's just my life. It's just the way it is. Like, he yells, I cry, then he's upset that I'm crying. Like, we just have this unhealthy dynamic, but I know he loves me. I mean, it's just kind of the mindset that a survivor is in, makes a lot of sense. I think it's really hard to then know how to present Saving Grace and the services we provide to the community, because if we send out a flyer saying, like, are you in a domestic violence relationship? No, will anyone see themselves in that wording versus, do you feel safe in your own home? It's like, that's a little different. And since it's kind of hidden, it's a little more elusive, not so black and white. I was struck by this quote in No Visible Bruises, a book I'm sure you're familiar with that I reference quite a bit. And she writes, abuse slowly erodes a person. Survivors often talk about emotional abuse being so much worse than physical abuse. And I'm curious, how often do you hear men attempt to justify their non-physical abuse, saying things like, well, it's not like I hit her? Like, how often is there an apparent disconnect that what they are doing in the relationship is abuse?
Oh, well, there's tons. I mean, I think that's one of the common qualities, is that they feel justified in what they're doing. If they didn't feel justified in what they were doing, they would more actively try to stop it or change it. So it's very common. Typically, there are all kinds of reasons why abusive partners give themselves permission to be abusive, but that's what they're doing. They're giving themselves permission. And certainly one of the things we see in some countries like the United States is there has been a significant decline in physical abuse over the past 20 plus years, actually. Especially over the course of the 90s, we saw a significant decline. And I think part of that was, we passed a variety of laws nationally against domestic violence, like the Violence Against Women Act, course, as a country, we got much more woke around O.J. Simpson and the O.J. Simpson case, in which he clearly had a history of domestic violence perpetration. There was much more community organizing. And this all paid off. There was a significant decline in kind of illegal domestic violence by about 2/3. From the early 90s to late 90s, there's about a 2/3 decline in the rates of domestic homicides in this country and significant physical assaults. Part of that was because of real change, people kind of stopping what they were doing. But part of, I think, what happened is they got the message in the United States that physical abuse is not okay. And so they stopped their physical abuse, even as they continued or escalated their non-physical forms of abuse, like verbal or psychological.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we see in our groups all the time. The easiest abuse to get our attendees to stop, at least temporarily, is the physical abuse. Typically because they're on probation, they're being monitored, they understand that if they do other acts of physical abuse, that could lead to further consequences. What the challenge is getting them to stop the other forms of abuse, the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse, the controlling behaviors. Mm-hmm. That's where the real work is. And that's really where much of our focus is on. So that's, I think, really partly what we need to be attending to.
Is there one, if I were to ask you, tell a story of when you saw the light bulb go off in someone you were counseling, like where you saw it finally connect, that they weren't, it wasn't physical, so it wasn't as obvious for them to connect the dots, but it was coercive, it was controlling, it was manipulative, and then with counseling you saw it finally hit. Is there something like that that's happened for you?
Yeah, well, sure. And I think part of what we need to understand is what drives domestic violence on the individual level is not behaviors, but simply the way we define it. It's belief systems. So being an abusive partner means you have a pattern of abusive behavior. In other words, it's not just that you're abusive once or twice. It's that you're being abusive over and over and over again. Now, a number of those abusive behaviors may be fairly subtle ones, but they're happening all the time. And the reason why you have these patterns of abuse is you have a thinking system. Basically, you have beliefs that make it okay. And a very common belief, and one of the books that I recommend the most still, even though it was written 25 years ago or more, is called The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans. It's still, in my opinion, the best book out there for the people to understand what it's like to be in an abusive relationship. And she talks about power over versus personal power. And so a very common belief system that abusive partners have is they have this outward focus. And they are quick to see other people as being against them, especially the people that are close to them. So they often see their partner as being against them. They see her as trying to push their buttons, as trying to provoke them, as being disrespectful towards them. We could go on and on and on. And so they often blame their own distress on their partner, even though most of the time their partner has very little to do with their distress. And so really it's about, by controlling their partner, by dominating their partner, by trying to turn their partner into a robot, their thinking is, I'll be happier. So they have this external focus. This is also why anger is very common. Anger is more of a symptom of domestic violence than a cause of it, a symptom of this way of thinking, this outward focus. And they also actually often feel quite powerless. And on a much milder level, the way to think about this is anybody who's been a parent is if we start thinking that we can control our children, that we are able to manage our children appropriately, we get very frustrated. Our children have minds of their own.
Yeah.
Right? What I have control over is not how my children behave. What I have control over is how I behave as a parent. If I focus on my behavior as a parent, that I can be successful at. So if I go into the grocery store and I've been pushing my luck a little bit too much, so my child is overly tired and they start to have a meltdown, I can't control that, but I can control how I respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
And so a key shift for people who are abusive is shifting from this outward focus or this external focus to this inward focus. Is rather than trying to control everybody around them, most of all their partner and their kids, it's really about controlling themselves and realizing that ultimately they're responsible for their own well-being. That if they're unhappy, it's not their partner's fault, it's their own responsibility. Mm-hmm. So what I would say is one of the striking things that can happen is certainly I've seen over the years people in our groups who have made this shift in their thinking. And what's really interesting is when they make this shift, things settle down for them. They're not nearly as agitated. They don't get as reactive. They don't get, their anger almost evaporates. They feel much more empowered because they're focusing on their true power, which is over themselves. So they become much more effective in their relationships. So that's typically kind of the aha moment. It's kind of this awareness, and of course, it doesn't often happen this abruptly. Although I've seen a few times where it has, but it can happen pretty quickly where they suddenly kind of get it. They realize, oh, I see. I need to just focus on managing myself. I need to stop focusing on these people around me so much and instead focus on myself. I need to stop blaming them for my struggles and realize I'm responsible for my own well-being. So that's, I think, a key part of the work. And when they make that shift, the changes that can happen can be striking and quite dramatic. And I've seen that happen over and over again. And that, of course, is quite gratifying when that happens.
And is it true? I mean, one thing I've seen either in some kind of, special that I found on YouTube or in reading No Visible Bruises, as she sat in on some support groups, that the men they have a place to share what they're observing, or what I heard you say was, so they kind of call each other out as a sense of like mutual accountability of how they're using their words and how maybe they're still justifying their behavior in their part of the relationship. Can you describe kind of a group dynamic?
Yeah. And so typically part of and of course, groups can vary a great deal around the country and even around the state. So there's not like just one way that groups are run. But in my opinion, the way that we run our groups and the way some other agencies likewise run their groups, it's really about having the men hold each other accountable. And it's really about, first, you have to help them understand what it is they're trying to do, how to be non-abusive, what that involves, taking responsibility for your choices, taking responsibility for your own well-being, learning how to work more collaboratively with the people that you love and care for. And of course, what's very common, as we talked about a little bit earlier, is the denial that goes with abusive behavior. Very, very common, where they minimize it, they rationalize it, they justify it, and so forth and so on. And so part of what the group work is about is helping them stop to do that denial, to get more honest, to move past the shame they may feel about their abusive behavior so they can talk about it in a candid way. And then really challenging them to work more on themselves and to take more responsibility, not only for their abusive behavior, but for all of their behavior. And so part of that is as group members get this idea and to understand these concepts better themselves and practice them, to help each other do the same thing. And so when they see somebody who's not doing a good job, to respectfully point that out, to help them see where their thinking is messed up or is not consistent with being respectful and things of that nature. So definitely there's a power to the group, which is why there's widespread consensus in the field that the best way of doing this work is in a group setting. It's much better than individual work, for example. And it really needs to be a specialized group. It can't just be a bunch of people hanging out. So it involves, in 12-step groups, which can be very powerful for addiction issues. There's what's called no crosstalk. In other words, people say their piece, but there's no challenging or confronting what people say. It's important in 12-step groups that people feel safe to say what they need to say and for others simply to listen. That would not work well in an abuse intervention group. There's got to be a willingness to challenge people when they're not being accountable, to confront that, to point that out. Which is why, like a self-help group for abusive partners is unlikely to be very effective because there isn't necessarily room for that kind of accountability work. And the idea is not to, make them feel ashamed or embarrassed or anything like that, or to punish them. It's just about helping them get honest with themselves and to not drift back into justifying or excusing their abusive behavior.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm curious, this is a little analogy, but when you said teach them how to not be abusive, it made me think of a friend of mine who lost 150 pounds one year. I mean, he was, he needed to do it for health reasons. And he told me after the fact, if you want to, how did he say it? If you want to lose weight, you'll probably do it. If you want to be healthy, you'll probably lose weight. He was talking about like the difference in focus, kind of the more holistic approach to that thing. that for him was unhealthy. He ate whatever he wanted when he wanted, that was unhealthy. So he focused on being healthy, and he happened to lose weight versus, so it just makes me think I'm sure it's not like, in the groups, like stop being abusive, stop those thoughts. It's not like
Right.
jumping on the negative, but in some way, how do you help the individuals focus on kind of the big picture and like a whole is like their whole self?
Yeah. So again, programs are vary somewhat. So some of the programs that work with abusive men are much more like classes, where there are a bunch of homework assignments, and it's mainly about presenting homework assignments, or it's mainly teaching lessons. So not all programs are the same. The way we do things at Allies and Change is our groups are much more interactive. So it's much more about teaching them some basic concepts and then repeating them over and over again. And in particular, how do they apply them into their day-to-day lives? So a lot of the group each week is focused on real life situations and challenges. How do you deal with when you and your partner have different values around finances? What do you do when your kids won't listen and it's time for them to do a chore? How do you handle when you tried to say the right thing, but your partner took it the wrong way? And we go on and on and on. And it's always about helping them figure out how to navigate these real life situations in ways that are respectful. Part of the seduction of abuse and control, especially the more subtle forms of it, is it's quick and easy and often works in the short run, right? So, if I don't like what you're saying, if I just yell at you, shut up, you may be quiet. See, I got what I wanted. I wanted you to be quiet. Now you're quiet. Of course, I pay for it because I've yelled at you. I've told you to shut up. I've been disrespectful, verbally abusive. And so there may be later consequences. But a lot of times there's an immediate benefit to being abusive, but a longer term consequence. And so part of it is helping our folks find alternative things. So if, rather than yelling at you to shut up when I don't like what you're saying, what can I learn to do instead? It's about learning other ways of behaving, learning other ways of approaching these situations and thinking about these situations.
Yeah, it makes you think of, maybe you don't do this specifically, but like Brene Brown, her thing is the story I'm telling myself is, and it's a way to like not escalate when you're feeling offended or defensive. The story I'm telling myself is you don't really care about how my day went. That's the story I'm telling myself by your body language. So taking a step back and finding the words with kind of that trick, seems, I've tried it before in my marriage. I think the first time my wife rolled her eyes like, oh, here's the thing you read about. Here's the trick. solve our arguments, But it is somewhat that kind of thing, like learning how to like self-regulate, to like hear differently and to pay attention to the cues and body language, and that it's not all about you just because of what you're interpreting in your partner.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's pretty fundamental. And again, it's like you said, the story that I'm telling myself, that has to do with the belief systems. And what's very common among abusive partners is what they're telling themselves is she's against me, or my kids are against me, or they're trying to provoke me, or if I don't let her know who's in charge, she'll take advantage of me. So there's a lot of this kind of seeing your partner as being against. And on the other hand, for example, a core thing we kind of teach them is, why don't you assume your partner is on your side? Assume your partner is your ally. These are radical thoughts to a lot of abusive partners. That's what inspired the name of the agency, Allies and Change, is it's really about helping abusive partners change the story that they're telling themselves, as Brene Brown puts it. And that's definitely a part of the work.
And one more thought I had too on the same topic here is I was given apparently I need to upgrade our thing in 10 minutes. I was given a book. One of my old bosses gave me this book called Love and Respect. And it was like a very simplified kind of cycle in a relationship of, specifically, if whoever starts it, if a man doesn't feel respected, then he's not going to show love to his wife. If the wife doesn't feel respected, she's not going to show respect for her husband. He doesn't feel respect, he's not going to show love. And it's that cycle, or no matter how it starts, which is a very simplified kind of, left, right stereo way of looking at it. But
Yeah.
it does make sense. I feel like, I've been married 13 years. I have seen that play out. If I start feeling like I'm not getting what I need, I stop giving as a self-protection, Any thoughts on that kind of cycle of how that plays into a more abusive relationship?
Well, what I would think is really important is that people who are abusive are really in a class by themselves. And so I think what you're describing is you may have a bit of that dynamic with your wife, but I'm going to assume for the moment that you're not abusive. So what that means is even when that dynamic's going on, you don't become disrespectful towards her.
Right.
You may get a little distant or a little withdrawn, or she may get the same, but there isn't verbal abuse going on. There's not manipulation going on. There aren't controlling behaviors going on, things of that nature. And so I think that one of the common things we do is we try to apply normal ways, non-abusive ways of behaving, as if that's the way what's going on in abusive relationships, and that's not the case. So these other things can aggravate it. So, for example, there may be a variety of ways that the abused partners don't act well, but that's not what causes the abuse. That may be what triggers the abuse, but it doesn't cause it. The abuse is caused by this person's pro-abuse belief system. It's their abuse belief system. And so the reality is, thankfully, many relationships, there's no abusive partner. And while each person's imperfect and flawed, and some of what you're describing can apply, that's typically what's going on in an abusive relationship. In the abusive relationship, the problem is that usually just one of these two people has a pro-abuse belief system. That's what drives the issue, and that's its own thing. Some of these other ideas can aggravate it, but they don't cause it. And so a common thing we do is, you're in an abusive relationship, you go to couples counseling. The couples counselor brings up their couples orientation, tries to make changes, and guess what? They rarely work. They can even make it worse because it isn't about a typical couples dynamic. It would be similar to, addiction issues. Well, it's true that anybody can get, have too much to drink once in a while. There's a huge difference between me getting drunk once in a blue moon and me being an alcoholic. And my alcoholism and addiction, that is my own distinct issue. Other things can aggravate my addiction, but for the most part, other things don't cause addiction. So, of course, those of us who do not have addiction issues, we may go through incredibly difficult times. We may lose our jobs, relationships may end, we may have major health issues, whatever our life struggles are. But we aren't going to become suddenly an alcoholic overnight. That's just we're not wired for that. And so I think it's the same thing with abusive behavior, that really what drives it is this belief system. Other dynamics can aggravate it, but these other dynamics, like this respect with, withdrawal thing, that doesn't cause domestic violence. It might aggravate it, but it doesn't cause it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a common mistake that we make, is we think some of these other things are causing it. Well, trauma, childhood trauma, right? Well, yes, it's true that some abusive partners do grow up in quite abusive homes, but there are tons of kids who grow up in abusive homes that don't become abusive partners when they're adults. And there are other abusive partners that grew up in perfectly fine homes. So yes, growing up in an abusive home may aggravate your abusive behavior and may trigger it, but it's not the primary driver of it. It's this pro-abuse belief system that is the primary driver of it.
That's well said. Appreciate that. 28 years wrapped up in 30 minutes or so. So I just have one last question. We got 5 minutes left on the Zoom timer here. You mentioned, there's the voluntary individuals that come in for this, and there's the court involved, the court mandated. Can I take a wild guess that the voluntary individuals end up having, maybe not in that relationship, having it kind of turn into something healthy, but maybe their future relationships? Would that be a safe assumption that the voluntary ones end up doing? No. Shaking your head immediately.
No, it's not. I mean, actually, what I would say is our voluntary clients are more likely to drop out because there's not the same leverage to keep them there. And so we actually have higher dropout rates among our voluntary clients. If a court-mandated person drops out, they could end up in jail. They could end up with other sanctions. So there's a real incentive to stay engaged. I mean, they may not want to be there, but they're going to still make themselves there because there's significant consequences. Whereas a voluntary person, typically there are fewer consequences or potentially fewer consequences. So it's interesting. So they're more likely to drop out than our court-involved people. But among those who stay, they stay the longest. And so we'll have voluntary clients stay with us for years because they're serious about making real changes. And they understand that those changes don't happen overnight. In fact, I would say that the gold standard of what we're looking for is that if they're staying with the person who's been abused, that the partner feels consistently emotionally safe in the relationship. That's what we're aiming for. Mm-hmm. That they feel consistently emotionally safe in the relationship, in contrast to how they felt before. What our experience is if that's going to happen, it often takes 2 or 3 years for it to happen, to the point where the partner is truly saying, great, we're there. Because typically what happens is they're better in this way, this and this is better, but there's this thing here. And then that's getting better, but there's that thing there. Mm-hmm. And so I wish it was faster. I wish we could, reach this gold standard quicker. But typically it takes years to do that, if they make it at all. And of course, some do not make those changes. But when they do, it can take a while. Now, among our court-involved folks, we can't keep them that long. Many of them have misdemeanor charges. And so what we're trying to do is just expose them to the material as best they can and hope that some of it sticks. So, that's the other issue, is that really, unfortunately, this is long-term work. And I say unfortunately because most people don't stay long enough to fully necessarily internalize it in the time that they're with us. So we do the best we can with what we've got available. So yeah, I would say ultimately some of the voluntary people change, but a lot of them also drop out.
Yeah, that actually makes more sense. And I feel like I did read that in one of these 2 books. Well, with the last couple of minutes we have, do you have like a 30-second, any lasting thought you'd like for our Central Oregon community to keep in mind along this topic?
Well, I think the next wave of stopping domestic violence does involve the community at large taking more action to, in a non-shaming way, identify people who are being abusive and encouraging them and using what leverage they have to get them engaged in services. And that doesn't necessarily mean calling the police or calling child welfare. It might be as an employer saying, you need to do this. Or as a minister saying, this is partly what you need to do. I'm going to keep an eye on you. Or as a mental health professional saying, I can help you with these other issues, but this one actually needs some specialized treatment. And you really need to go to this other program to get that. So I think part of it is really as a community encouraging and supporting abusive partners getting help in terms of the longer term focused specialized services they need to make real changes, and keeping an eye on them to make sure that they follow through on that and they stay engaged as opposed to dropping out or disengaging. So that's, I think, kind of a place that needs to happen in the next coming years. That's, I think, where we need to be headed.
It's good stuff, Chris. Thank you again for lending your voice here with us. So very much appreciate your expertise and your time. So thank you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Learn more about us at saving-grace.org. Thanks for joining us.